Hello again. So Fischer against Sicilian. e4, c5. Against Sicilian, Fischer also had a very impressive score, just like against most other moves. He liked very much to play variations with bishop c4 in the main lines of Sicilian. So after knight f3, so in many variations, for instance, after d6, d4, take, knight f6, knight c3, e6 in the Scheveningen variation. He played variations with bishop c4, bishop b3, castle short usually, although he also played with variations with castle long, so the so-called Sozin variation. Actually, Gligovic once said that this is Fischer's universal weapon against Sicilian, the variations with bishop c4. Of course, he worked a lot on these lines, and he was very careful with all information which appeared in the chess literature. And here is an example, the game Fischer-Rubinetti. So, after e4, c5, knight f3, take, here bishop c4, what I said, a6, b5, rook e1, knight d7, bishop g5, h6, bishop h4. The theory these days considers that in this position black should play g5, bishop g3, knight e5. But knight c5 looks a very logical move, but it has a tactical drawback, bishop d5, very strong piece sacrifice. If black doesn't accept the piece sacrifice, then he has all these weak squares. White will also continue with a4. The position is actually not pleasant at all for black. In the game, black took on d5. Here I should say that, okay, the game was played in 1970. We see that in the interzonal tournament. 1 year before this game, in 1969, there was a game already played with bishop d5 in the Hungarian Championship, which didn't go unobserved by Robert Fischer. And this is very typical for Fischer's preparation in the opening. He was very careful at everything what was played everywhere, even in national championships. Of course, these days we have databases and things appear to be much easier. But in Fischer's time, this was a very impressive and very powerful approach. Perhaps I should also mention here an episode which happened in the second game of the match Fischer-Taimanov, where Fischer qualified after this interzonal tournament. We know the result of the game because Fischer won the match 6-0. But the beginning of the match especially was very double-edged and hard fought, because Taimanov had many chances also. Then at some moment, just like Larsen later on, he just collapsed, because everywhere Fischer would end up winning. But in the second game there was an episode which was similar to what we are looking here, where Fischer used a new move which Taimanov was unaware of. The move was actually mentioned in a theoretical book which appeared in Soviet Union, written by Master Nikitin, which was later Kasparov Turner. And Fischer noticed this move in a small chess monograph in Soviet Union, and Taimanov didn't. And later on, Taimanov in his book describes this episode that later when he found it out, he was completely shocked that Fischer, a foreigner with a foreign language, he noticed a book which appeared in Soviet Union, and Taimanov, who was a big specialist and who prepared very well for the match and who was a specialist in Sicilian, didn't notice this move recommended by Nikitin. And here we see again, so Fischer uses his knowledge and he destroys his opponent in the opening. let's see a few more moves before knight a4, take, and c4. So white has a long-lasting attack against black's king. His idea is just to open files. For the moment he has one pawn, but next move he has already two pawns. And of course he doesn't exchange queens. And after c5, black's position is basically lost because too many open files against the king. Actually, it is interesting that even nowadays there are grandmasters who lose in such a way with the black pieces, who miss the move bishop d5. It is interesting that Fischer opponents, just to see the difference in this approach and preparation for the games, different level of knowing the opening theory. Although Fischer opponents were very well aware of the fact that Fischer is well prepared and that he plays the Sozin variations, nevertheless, from time to time they would simply collapse in the opening. And for instance, in the next example, the game Fischer-Larsen, the third game from the match against Larsen, Fischer played against the Sozin variation, and let's see what happened. e6, bishop b3, everything well-known moves, castle short, a6. Later, Larsen played here queen c8, but look what happened in the third game after f5. It is better, of course, for black here to play even before a6, to take here on d4 and play then bishop c6. This is nothing so difficult, but sometimes Fischer opponents, it was unexpected, difficult to explain what happened to them. Queen c8 was played by Larsen, a move which loses immediately after take on e6, doesn't matter with what, and knight a4. This is the idea. Black loses because of weak square b6 and the weak pawn on e6. He loses material, and this happened in the candidates matches. A quarter final candidates match. This happened in the game. White is of course completely winning. He is a pawn up, two bishops, and it is quite impressive how Fischer opponents usually so often would collapse. Even it was clear what Fischer would play. So Fischer's knowledge was, and Fischer's personality was so strong that they would simply collapse. Actually, in the Sozin variation, only Spassky succeeded to neutralize Fischer's opening preparation in their match, World Championship match from 1972. In the fourth game of the match, Spassky showed a clear way for black to play against the Sozin variation. And by the way, after that fourth game with the white pieces, Fischer never played Sozin again. Moreover, in the sixth game, so the next white game for Fischer, he started the game with first move c4. And this was not only one time opening. He started with the move c4 in several other games with very good results. He won 2 games and made 2 draws by starting the game with c4 in that match against Spassky. But let's return to Sicilian. It is also well known what Fischer said about Dragon Sicilian. In some positions, he said that thanks to his big experience, also including in blitz games, he developed a science how to play against the dragon. Just open the H file, sack, and mate. And here is the position where he said this. The game against Larsen, 1958. In this position, white played h4 in the game. If black plays h5, then white plays g4 and h5. This is typical attack for dragon. after h4. Actually, Fischer considered this position already with practically winning for white, winning attack. Later in analysis, it was proved again that things are not very simple. Queen b5 was played, h5, rook fc8. Again, if black here takes on f, even after g takes h5, white continues with g4. The main idea is just to open files and to create an attack against the king. So after rook fc8, white took on g6, h takes d6. Notice that the bishop on b3 is very important in white's attack, and actually Fischer put a great value for this bishop on b3. Also in this game, earlier in this game, Larsen had a possibility to close the diagonal a2 d8, but he missed this, and Fischer considered this already to be winning for white. g4, important also to get square h2 and to control square h5, a5, g5, knight h5, and now Fischer takes on h5. He wrote in his book that this is so obvious that it doesn't even require any explanation. Take and g6. White is just in time. You see that everything is one tempo. If black would have played a4, then he would have been okay, but it's often, especially in Dragon Sicilian, the question of one tempo is decisive. So after g6, black played e5, but then g takes f7, king goes away, and bishop e3. White has a winning attack, and because here he has ideas with bishop h6, queen takes d6, black is not able to defend this position. Later, as I said, it was shown that things were not so simple. Black should have taken on d4 before taking on h5, and the position is not entirely clear, because after take g6, now black has a very strong move, rook c4, and although white is better, deep analysis of this position shows that in fact black should be able here to escape with a draw. But this was Fischer's approach in Dragon Sicilian, and he scored. He won almost all his games in against Dragon Sicilian, and he also showed some surprisingly new ideas for that period in our next example in the game. Here, yes, against Gligovic, black played here knight c4, and white automatically here takes on c4. And this is also not bad, also in this position, just to take, and to continue just a normal idea g4. And if black plays h5, he can't castle long now. Short, white will retreat the knight from d4, and the pawn on h6 will be weak. But white plays h3, and black always has these problems on the king side with his pawn structure. This is a proved method of play for white. But suddenly in this game against Gligovic on 1959, Fischer played queen e2. This was a complete shock also for Gligovic, who later said that this is a move which won the game. In fact, this move leads to double-edged positions. After take on e3, queen takes e3, black remains with this strong bishop on g7, and his position is, of course, playable. But the shock of the entire idea was so big that Gligovic lost quickly. The idea is that white now remains with this bishop, which Fischer liked a lot. The bishop from b3, he considered this a very important attacking piece. So let's see a few more moves. What happened? Castle, g4. White still wants to advance the pawns with two ideas. First of all, of course, to open files on the king side and to create an attack, but also to drive away black's pieces, and important the knight from f6, and to use this square d5 and white's superiority in the center. This is also a possibility to play the dragon with white pieces, to combine this play in the center and on the king side. So after g4, black played queen a5, h4. Black can play here also h5 at different moments. But then white would play g5, driving away the knight from f6. For instance, knight goes back. And now white has also this idea with f4, f5, which is quite simple to play and very strong, particularly with this bishop from b3 supporting the advance of the white's pawns on the king side. After h4, black played e6, but this creates this weakness on e6, which was immediately spotted by Fischer by playing knight d2. Now black has problems with this pawn on d6. Grigorich played here rook c6. Now one continues his initial ideas, take, and f4. Now this position is difficult for black because white has everything very solid on the queen side. His king is safe, but he has his own ideas to advance. f5, and white has pressure in the center. So black can still fight in this position. The position remains complicated, but objectively, again, it is already better for white, and Fischer won this game in something like 30 moves, so quite quickly. After 12 moves, I think he won this game. It must be said that also in against Sicilian, Fischer had played some sidelines which later became very important part of the theory. For instance, in the Najdorf system with the white pieces, he was very successful by playing the sixth move, h3, knight f6, knight c3, a6, h3. So Fischer considered this move. First of all, the merit of this move was that it fights against black's main idea in the Najdorf to play e5. Because after knight d2, Fischer considers that white will play g4 and knight g3, and he will have clearly better prospects. This is only partially true, because later it was proved that in this position black can prevent white's intentions by playing h5. But of course this was too early to discover in those days. So the move e5 wasn't played. His opponents here tried many moves. g6 is a normal move. Almost every move here is playable for black. But Fischer analyzed very deep such positions, and he had just a better understanding, and there was no existing theory, so his opponents would collapse quite quickly. Perhaps I can show here the game against, or a few moves against Najdorf. So Fischer, Najdorf, it was played in the Olympiad. Black played b5, which looks very logical. He wants to develop the bishop on b7, and the next move for white, knight d5, is also typical for Fischer. He wanted to exploit immediately the drawbacks of b5, and here the main drawback is that black weakens square c6, and also white has now ideas to attack the pawn on b5 with c4, a4. But it is interesting, for instance, after knight d7, so white obviously now his main idea is to take on f6 to break black's pawn structure, and knight d7 looks like a normal move, but loses immediately the queen. Quite an interesting catch of the queen. And if black takes on d5, then again white's pawn structure is very good, and we see this weak square c6. White will continue with c4, and the black remains with this pawn on e7. So white has positional advantage. After knight d5, if black takes here on e4, then white has a very strong initiative by playing queen f3. We see two centralized knights and the queen, and black's knight is hanging on e4. This is very dangerous for black. So after knight d5, Najdorf played bishop b7. Now white took on f6 and played c4. He doesn't protect the pawn on e4, which was taken after b takes e4, bishop takes e4, black takes on e4. So I remind you, this is a game from 1962 from the Chess Olympiad, Fischer against Naidov. White simply castled, and we see the strategy. White strategy, he sacrificed the pawn for a quick development. Black's king is still in the center. Black played here d5, white played rook e1. It's clear that white has a pressure, and already next move is a mistake by black. Black has many alternatives, but the position is not simple at all, and it's rather difficult to play. After e5, white played check on a4, knight d7, and rook takes e4. Very nice take on e4, knight f5. White's position is completely winning here because the knight is dominating on f5. Black cannot do anything against it. The king remains on e8, and white will bring the rook into play, and the extra exchange, of course, doesn't help black. So white won very quickly this game, Fischer-Naidov. So after this game, the move h3 became popular, and if we look nowadays, almost even top players, almost every top player tried to play also h3, and there are many players who play it on a regular basis with the white pieces. Next we will move to other moves after e4, but for now this is all. Thank you.